I'm so excited to have with us today some of the best in the field. I mean, we've got Travis, who is all about declarative ML, and he did some really cool stuff and is still doing some really cool stuff with open source Ludwig, and of course, working at Predibase. And we also have a man from a company full of evangelists, but this man is the chief evangelist, you could say, Julien. And then, of course, we've got Ed. What more can I say about Ed that he has not said himself? I'm going to let him take over and be the first one to introduce us to what he's been working on, and then we'll go down the line and I'll let the others say a little bit more about what they're doing. So Ed, can you kick it off for us, man? It's of course always a pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm excited for this.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Demetrius. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I'm Ed. As you mentioned, right, I work at a company called Seldon. Like importantly, I think just to set the context, right, about where I come to this discussion from is what we do is like the last mile of machine learning. So it's like deployments, scaling things up, monitoring them, drift detection, all that kind of stuff. And that's where it actually becomes really interesting at the moment, because I noticed you touched on like LLMs there. One of the big things for us is like our customers are saying, well, should we be deploying these in-house? Should we build our own LLMs? Should we just trust OpenAI or whatever and throw all our data at it, right? And a lot of them aren't willing to do that. So tons of interesting things that happen there. And then, for us, like as software builders, how do we support that, right? Traditionally, models that people built in-house weren't that big, and now suddenly people want to run stuff on 8 A100s all at once, right? And it changes the way that we want to deploy them. So that's my kind of approach to this session.
I love that, dude. I'm so excited for what we're going to talk about. I definitely want to get into the monitoring piece. I think that's something that we don't necessarily get to talk about enough, and so we'll get there though. Next up, I got Julien. How you doing, man? Can you give us a bit more in-depth intro than I could ever do?
Sure. So thank you very much for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on time zones. So yeah, I'm Julian. I'm actually home today. Just got back from a trip again, so yeah, traveling a lot and meeting customers, enterprise, startups, public sector, technical communities, and trying to help them understand the insanity, the current insanity around LLMs and foundation models and chatbots and open source models versus closed source models, and when to use what model, et cetera, et cetera. And at Hugging Face, we have quite a few models. That slide in my deck is outdated every single day. I keep updating it, but it's a lost cause. And that's great, because we have lots of different architectures. We have lots of different fine-tuned models for a wide range of use cases. But then, I guess the number one question is, which model do I use? And do I use that model as is, or do I need to fine tune it? And if so, how do I do that? So it's exciting because we have tons of tools, but that huge quantity of different tools and models also creates some complexity. And it's great to get a chance to discuss that with all of you, and hopefully shed some light on how to get started quickly and how to get good results, and still stay open.
Love it. Travis, how you doing, dude?
Great to be here, Demetrius. So I'm from Predibase, probably not as big of a household name as Seldon or Hugging Face at this point in time, but our company is also very deeply ingrained in the LLM space. We founded about 2 years ago, focused on finding ways to make state-of-the-art deep learning technologies more accessible and scalable to the broader enterprise and engineering communities. We came out of Uber AI. I spent some time there as tech lead for the deep learning infrastructure team, helped build and architect an open source framework called Horavad, which is one of the early distributed training systems. and also worked on a project with my co-founder Piero Molino called Ludwig, which is about providing this declarative SQL-like abstraction layer on top of deep learning and machine learning technology, with the idea being that we can declaratively specify what you want and then sort of figure out ways to optimize how best to scale it, how best to train what model architectures to use under the hood. And I think the really interesting thing about it, I'm sure this is probably familiar to other folks like Julien as well, is that, you know, prior to the last year or so, you know, we were saying, hey, deep learning is great. It can do all these amazing things. And most people were saying, well, you know, what we really want is XGBoost. And now I think things have kind of changed very dramatically in the past few months, where suddenly everyone wants to be doing deep learning. Everyone wants to be using large language models. And now the question is really like, how do I best do that? Like what techniques, what technologies do I need in order to solve my use case? And that's ultimately, I think, what we're trying to solve as a community, is making that a lot more easy to navigate.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to come hot out the gates because I want to hear some hot takes from you all. And I'm going to kind of throw this one up there and let anyone jump at it. Is there an open source model that's as good as ChatGPT? Because it's really hard to figure that out. And it's really hard to know. There's all these benchmarks, but the benchmarks, like, let's be honest, the benchmarks don't really mean anything, considering you may have these researcher benchmarks that are cool, but when you actually try and use them on your data or for your use case, it may not be as clear which model is going to be better or worse. And I think people just kind of opt for the one that they know, which right now is the OpenAI API. You all are coming here. This is a open source conversation. So where are we going there? Like, is it maybe there's models that are better for certain use cases, or there's models that are better just all around because of all that restrictive nature that OpenAI has been doing on their model? Where are we at? Like, who wants to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to comment on that. I think that, you know, just bluntly, like right now, there's probably no model better than GPT-4 for every task. But, you know, most people out there who are interested in LLMs aren't trying to solve every task, right? It's like if you're trying to build a customer service automation system, you don't need a model that can produce alliterative poetry, right? So I think ultimately what it comes down to is that when you're putting these things in production, what you really care about is task-specific performance, latency, throughput, cost. Those are the top of mind considerations for you. And as such, what you really want to do is try to find the smallest possible model that gets the task done with the best performance, not like the best general purpose model. And so I think the thesis that we all have in the open source community is not that necessarily there's going to be this one, you know, like singular open source LLM that's going to beat every other closed source LLM, but rather that for any given task, a smaller, more specialized model will ultimately be able to beat out these larger general purpose models once you actually go into production.
Yeah, I think Travis, you made like a couple of really good points there, which were like, you know, latency and cost, right? Which currently people don't really look at. We go like, oh, GPT-4 is amazing, and look at all these amazing things I can do with it. But you know, in reality, if you're going to use that for absolutely everything, like, you know, take your call center example, right? I want summaries of every transcript, right? And I want, you know, a whole load of entities extracted. That kind of thing is going to cost you an absolute fortune. And also each of those requests, right? The GPT-4 API at the moment takes like 10, 15 seconds to come back. It's probably not going to be feasible, right? If you've got hundreds of thousands of customer calls coming in. So that's where I think, you know, yeah, particularly in the deployment space, people are starting to worry about, how do we run these? You know, what is the cost of these? Is there something that gets me 90% of the way there that's good enough, that I can run at an absolute fraction of the cost and it will perform way better?
Yeah, couldn't agree more with Travis and Ed right there. It's really what every single customer conversation sounds like these days. It starts with, oh, we tried ChatGPT, we kind of like the user experience, although when we get deep into our domain, we start seeing, you know, very shallow answers or potentially completely wrong answers, you know, hallucinations. And then when we do when we look at using it in a production scenario, costs and latency and privacy and intellectual property don't really work. And so that's where, so we have to thank OpenAI for doing the marketing for us, because now we don't have to convince people it's important to use AI and LLMs. And the conversation jumps very quickly. So, okay, what can open source do for me? And what are the models out there that are great enough on general purpose questions, and great enough on my own personal domain, which could be life sciences or chemical engineering, and et cetera, even if it means fine tuning it. And how do I, exactly what Ed said, or Travis said, sorry, how do I find the smallest model that gets the job done? Because the smallest model will be easier to fine tune, cheaper to fine tune and host, faster, et cetera, and you'll be able to deploy it anywhere, on-prem, in the cloud, but you will still maintain full control. This is really, this is the whirlwind tour of literally every single conversation I'm having with customers. And I guess the next question is, okay, which model do I pick? And so we've built, in the last couple of weeks, we've built an open LLM leaderboard on Hugging Face that shows you, the top performing models on the Eleuther AI benchmarks. And I agree, generally benchmarks are just telling part of the story. But just so you know, the top one today is a model called Falcon, 40 billion parameters, trained in the Arab Emirates. So, what are the West Coast dudes up to right now? I mean, come on. It's a global race. So I'm very happy to see, global models. And it's pretty amazing, that Falcon model. So go and try it on Hugging Face. And I'm sure next week something even better will show up. So, you have to do the homework constantly.
That's it. It does feel like every week.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Demetrius.
It does feel like every week a new one comes out. But yeah, hit it, Ed.
I was going to say, yeah, I actually, been following that leaderboard quite closely. And what's amazing from that is that, the open source models, even if you just look at them against the benchmarks, is how quickly they're catching up, right? GPT-4, we don't know the details of the model, but, the assumed numbers of parameters are kind of near to 1 trillion is what people are thinking. And we've got models there that are, you just mentioned Falcon, 40 billion parameters. And it's beating out models that were 65 billion parameters or bigger.
Exactly. And that's a good sign, because the previous sheriff in town was Llama 65 billion. We've all heard about Llama, and it's an amazing model. Although the licensing is tricky for commercial use. And now we've got Falcon, which is 40 billion. So, let's say, 30% smaller, outperforms very nicely and is more commercial friendly. So what's not to like, So the race is going in the right direction, which is better model, smaller models, and commercial friendly models.
Well, you did bring up something there, Julien, that is commercial friendly. And I would imagine a lot of people here are actually trying to figure out how to get business value from their initiatives. And so there's the whole piece around, how can I get this model to do what I want it to do? And whether that is, I'm going to do some information retrieval, or I'm going to do some few shot learning in my prompts, or I'm going to fine tune this, or maybe I just need a bigger model. It seems like there's a lot of exploration and knobs that you need to turn. How have you all seen this? Travis, I know you were mentioning before we actually jumped on this panel that you've seen some people have success with things. And so maybe you could walk us through what you've been seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this to me is the pivotal thing about this whole LLM moment that's so amazing, is that it used to be the case that, like, why did people struggle with getting value from machine learning? It was like because you had to go through these laborious processes of generating these like very curated data sets, and you had to be an expert in knowing how to tune hyperparameters and set learning rates and know how to do distributed training and all this other stuff. And now what's really kind of made things open up in a big way to a bigger audience, like specifically a much more like non-data science specialized engineering audience, has been this capability that LLMs provided. Like you can just start getting value from day one. Like instead of thinking about it as being like a pipeline of data prep, train, serve, it's now like serve and then back out from there, everything else that you want to do. And so, you don't need data anymore to get started. You don't need a data science degree anymore to get started. You start by serving a model like maybe Falcon 40 billion, 7 billion, whatever, start doing some prompting. And you start to have this journey where you iterate on prompts, until you reach kind of a plateau of what you can do there. Then maybe you start iterating on like doing information retrieval, like try to get some better examples in there. And then as you accumulate more data over time, you get to the point where it makes sense to start doing these more sophisticated techniques like fine tuning. And hopefully by then, you've accumulated enough exemplars naturally through your kind of prompt engineering journey that it starts to be feasible to do this sort of fine tuning without having to like go back to square one and think about like data prep and data curation. So the way that I think about it is that in a lot of ways, the destination is still the same. Like you need a very customized, specialized model to do the job in the optimal way. But the journey is very different, right? The journey is no longer about, bootstrapping the data and whatever. It's about experimenting, like trying a few things out, seeing what works well. And then, if that's good enough, you can stop there. But if not, there's like all these other options under the hood that are available. And that's the path to get there, as opposed to, getting the data science degree and then getting started.
So true. So true. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
I guess just to add, the title of this is around open source, right? And everything Travis has just talked about, that journey that, potentially people who weren't experienced data scientists or machine learning engineers have gone through in learning how to use these APIs and large language models. Like if we look at the hottest open source tool by far right now, it's LangChain, right? And that's because it helps them go on that journey from, hey, I can write a prompt and just throw it at the API. And now I need multiple prompts. I need to store them. I need to be able to chain them together. I need to be able to build agents that can interact. And what's cool about that is that like we're building this huge open source tool that actually you can kind of swap the model in and out of, right? Doesn't matter if you use OpenAI's GPT-4 at the end of it, or whether you want to use Falcon or whatever else is top of the leaderboard in a few months' time. And that's why I think it's really cool, right? It's like open source is winning that space like massively.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, I keep telling customers models are expandable. I mean, don't fall in love with the models. The top model today is going to be superseded in a matter of weeks. And if you can avoid training, then that's great because you're saving, time and money. You're getting to production quicker. And it's really about, understanding how to use a particular model for a particular business use case, and deploy it quickly, start getting business value quickly. Maybe do some, like as we said, few shot prompting and et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, maybe doing a bit of fine tuning if you have some really domain specific data. But then another model will come up, and you need to be able to replace it quickly. And I think, and you get to make that decision, so that's the thing to me. You need to be in control of the whole process. You need to know what the model does. You need to know when to switch to another model, or when to use another model for another use case. So there's no Swiss Army knife model out there. It's not a question of how big they build them. They're never going to be able to do all of it. And so understanding that matching process between business questions and models, and figuring out, there's a better one, let's switch it. This is a really key thing, and I think it's the core of the discussion. Not so much what architecture is this, and how many layers does it have, and how many parameters. Exactly. We don't care. If it's good enough, let's deploy it, and if something better comes up, we'll update it. Don't fall in love with the models. Fall in love with the data sets. Fall in love with the fine tuning that you do, but the models are just expandable.
Well, there is something to be said about switching out the models, that whole hot swapping, because later each model performs a little differently, and you prompt them differently, or you have to do a bit of knob turning every time you bring out a model. And so it's not like you can just say, all right, new API or new model, and everything's going to work perfectly. And I do know there are open source tools that are coming out on that layer of the stack too, that are saying, okay, we're going to help you figure out basically how you can test your prompts. Like instead of you testing software, you're testing prompts. And so it does feel like that is one way to help out. But I mean, it's great to see all of this. It is very cool. Ed, you looked like you wanted to say something when I said that. What did you want to say? I see it in your eyes.
I'm actually, this is, I don't know. I was actually thinking of a question that maybe I'm gonna pass to Julien, but you don't have to answer it.
Go ahead.
And you mentioned data sets, right? And I think this is a really interesting topic in open source right now, because if you look at companies who've used open data sets, right, like Stability AI, for example, right, that it's almost backfired in that like they get in trouble because people look at the data set and go, hey, you stole our data, right? It's in this open source data set. And you do the complete opposite end of the spectrum is like OpenAI, who've just gone and basically, for lack of a better word, like stolen the whole internet, but not told anyone that they've done it, right? And so whilst everyone knows it, then no one can prove it. And so they've kind of protected themselves. And so are we seeing people, because of the likes of OpenAI, now suddenly protecting their data sets and locking them behind? I don't know, like from a Hugging Face perspective, you're seeing more, less of that.
So as you know, we're also hosting data sets, and we see very healthy growth on the number of data sets that we have. So I think when it comes to, and this is more of a probably of a pre-training discussion than a fine-tuning discussion, because fine-tuning is always going to happen on, I would say, company data, my financial reports, my life sciences reports, my customer support emails, etc., which by design are going to be your intellectual property. But I think for pre-training, there's always going to be a ton of publicly available data out there, right? Wikipedia and the Pile data set and YouTube captions. And so I don't think there's going to be any shortage of that. I think the main concern here is what's the quality of that stuff. So you could think, okay, Wikipedia is reasonably good quality, but there could still be some bias and issues with that. Maybe Reddit forums or tweets are more problematic. So, be careful with that stuff. But generally, customers who are doing pre-training still need to have general purpose data, because an LLM at the core, even if it's a financial LLM like the Bloomberg GPT model, it is the language model. So it needs to understand, English and French and German and Hindi and other languages, right? So you will still need a healthy quantity of curated quality internet data, so that the model can be hopefully on par with the closed models on general purpose questions, which users will still ask. And then it will actually outperform on your domain specific data. Again, Bloomberg has probably the largest stash and the best stash of financial data everywhere, but this could apply to other industries. So I think it's a mix. And again, the high value models come from high value data. If we're all training models on Wikipedia and the Pile, then it is a bit of a silly race. It becomes a competition on benchmarks. And that's probably not where we want to go. So I think it's important to also see those pre-trained industry-specific models, which will be a mixture of general purpose data and industry data.
Just to add on to that, I think when you look at the Falcon paper, like what really it came down to was they had a better quality data set, which was actually not about more
exactly.
data, it's actually about removing data in order to make the data better, right? And I think that to this point about people wanting to opt out of these systems, it's like I think we're starting to realize that just throwing more data at is not really the solution. Like we need better data sets. And so like giving people the tools to say, I don't want to include this in my data set is actually just as important, if not more important, than finding ways to get more data. So I actually don't think these things are necessarily in conflict in the long term. Like as we find better ways of curating data, we can find ways to, honor people's privacy and data, ability to kind of own their own data, right? While still being able to create good models. And I think even that's in pre-training as well as fine-tuning. The Lima paper by Meta recently demonstrated that like higher quality, fewer examples beats tons of like bad examples, right? So I think that's definitely the trend that we're going to see in the long term.
Yeah, and to add to that,
100%.
I mean, deduplication is very important. It's never really discussed, but we saw that from a number of customers, and we also saw it on our the model we published, the Star Coder model, which is a coding assistant and a coding chatbot. We started from loosely licensed GitHub repos, ended up having almost 7 terabytes. And then we deduplicated it to, I think, 2.5 terabytes. And we actually got better results on the deduplicated data than on the initial data set. Not to mention, of course, shorter training times and savings. So absolutely, high quality data is critical. And in that particular instance, less can be more. And you have to be very, very picky what goes there, what goes into your fine tuning or pre-training data.
Yep. Who would have thought? Who would have thought we were going to be able to say this? But garbage in, garbage out. It's still viable. It still is real. We've got a few questions coming through in the chat. I've only got time to ask one of them. Well, I'll let you all go. We'll see. What would be a use case for a Falcon model, though? How practical, cost-effective are some of these large models? Is it really just a space race here to outperform the next person? From Angelica.
Well, I think it really is task dependent, right? Because, you say, why do you need 40 billion parameters if I'm just trying to do like, review sentiment classification or something like that? It's like, yeah, you probably don't, right? And I think that's where the value of having this idea of like swappable models becomes really valuable. This is something that, this is really our opportunity, open source communities, to make that plug and play nature of like, oh, I want to try it with a 10 billion parameter model, a 1 billion parameter model, a 500 million parameter model, and make that like as easy as a single parameter, right? Which is like in a large way what we're trying to do with the Ludwig open source project. Like that's ultimately the way that we verify whether or not we even need these things and where the diminishing returns start to become noticeable. But there are some use cases where it absolutely is valuable. For example, one of the things I think LLMs really unlocks in a powerful way is some of these more advanced generative use cases, right? And like, I'm not going to throw a 500 million parameter BERT model at like generating some kind of complex JSON structure or maybe generating a response to a customer ticket that comes in or something like that. So you really do need a model that has a deep understanding of language and sort of the patterns that exist between different semantic concepts in language. Like those things are very valuable, as we've seen with some of the what people call the emergent properties of systems like ChatGPT, right? Whether or not those are real or kind of like an artifice is, not clear, but it's definitely the case that there are powerful like capabilities that are unlocked when you have that. And so I do think that there are going to be applications for these very large models, particularly when you fine tune them to do something very task specific. But it is going to need to be taken on a case by case basis. And I think we're at a moment right now where there's a tendency to be a little bit like, oh, let's use LLM as a hammer for every single thing we can. That's probably not going to be the long term, but I do think LLMs are here to stay for certain applications where that kind of background knowledge is needed.
So good. So, y'all, this has been great. I could keep talking for hours, but as you know, I see Rebecca popped up again, which probably means we've already gone over on time. And I will invite everyone, if you enjoyed this conversation and you enjoy virtual events, we are going to be having a LLM in production conference in a week. And so I'll drop a link in the chat for anyone who wants to do that. Piero from Predibase, Travis's colleague, is going to be there, and Omar from Hugging Face, Julien's colleague, is going to be there. And who knows, Ed may make a special appearance too. We'll see if we get lucky. Thank you all for doing this with us. This has been awesome. I learned a ton, and it was absolute blast to talk with you.